Thank you, Paul and Alice, for inviting me to come. This is the talk I would like to give. My abstract is what I intended to produce. What comes out is I'm not quite sure. I've got some bits which are semi-improvised and some bits which I'm going to read, because I want to try and provide a bit of kind of theory context to my work, which I think might be relevant to a lot of people that are working here, and touches on agency and technology and our relationship with each other. I'm going to start a little bit with my background. I too have desktop ecologies. My first real kind of improvised gig with technology was with John Bowers in Sonorities, I think in 2005. He doesn't remember, but he did this piece called X large, XXX large, which I think permanently damaged my hearing. It was a nice loud gig. And from that, at the end of it, John came up to me and said, I like the kinds of sounds that you're making. And that gave me enough confidence to kind of continue doing performances like this. So I have a history of, this is performing with Jason Dixon, actually in Norwich, of working in this way. Also have a bit of a history of working machine listening. The piece on the left is a piece called Excuse Me, which is a series of kind of actuated violins that each individual listen to their environment and try and recreate the sounds they're hearing through a shared library of sounds. That's a piece I did as part of my PhD a long time ago. And the piece on the right of that actually has Nick in. I think that's from 2008, that picture, which is a physical manifestation of an algorithm. And I'm quite interested in taking algorithms out of the computer and placing them in the natural world, either through speakers and actuators or through trying to make physical constructions. And it seems to chime in a way a lot of people are working, how we can get complexity, how we could incorporate the environment as part of that way we're working. Most recently, I've been working quite extensively with Paul, looking at ambiguity as a source of improvisation, how we can explore the relationship between machines in a live performance, and how we can use that to act as a springboard for creativity within those kind of performances. And as part of that, we've been looking at instrumental agency. James Ferguson writes in this paper about what he calls feral technologies, which is partly where the name the feral cello comes from. So he conceives what he calls imagined agencies in his instruments. So he's given them quite a low level of agency. He's not saying they're real agents, but you can think of them as having personalities. He talks about fighting with his instruments on stage, negotiating with them in a live performance. And that, again, is a springboard for improvisational creativity. We could conceptualize that using Daniel Dennett's intentional stance. So he writes that one way of interpreting a machine that's too complex to break down into its individual elements is to kind of interpret it as if it has beliefs and desires and intentions, even if it perhaps does not. So his example of this is a chess-playing robot. So the best way to play chess against, say, DeepMind 2, which I think this is a picture of, is to assume that it has the intention to beat you at chess, rather than to go through every line of code and predict what the outcome's going to be. So we're ascribing intentionalities and beliefs to the technologies in order to better understand them and have a relationship with them. At the kind of other end of the scale, also very influenced by David Borgo, who's been taking action network theory as a way of conceptualizing distributed agency or interagency. So actually ascribing agency or recognizing the agency of the technology as part of the process. This is stolen from his talk he did at Bournemouth in a workshop Paul and I organized about 18 months ago, showing different levels of agency and the way we can conceptualize things in this way. So what I want to talk about in a bit more detail, which is really kind of the bit I'm going to read out, is two notions of performativity. And the first person I want to talk about is Andrew Pickering's Mangal of Practice. So Pickering is a sociologist, a philosopher, and a historian of science, who I first came across when I was doing my PhD here at SARC. And he has a paper called After Representation, Science Studies in a Performative Idiom. And he's interested in asking questions regarding agency. a question of who acts, who does what to whom, how and why. And to develop this theme, he contrasts two different idioms to thinking about science, the representational idiom and the performative. So the representational idiom of science takes granted that the defining characteristic of science is the production of representations of nature, facts and theories. So that kind of presupposes two different independent kind of entities, representations and things that they represent. Also, it presupposes distinct boundaries between humans and nature, or between subjects and objects. In the performative idiom, Pickering gives a level of agency not just to humans, but also to the natural world, which he describes as things like the weather, bubble chambers, you'll see why in a minute, machine tools, TV sets, and atomic bombs. He suggests that these entities are continually acting and performing in ways that aren't reducible in a naked human agency, so they actually have an agency themselves. There's two things in the essay which he thinks we need to consider. One is to try and understand scientific practice as a temporally unfolding practice, something that changes over time. And secondly, to decenter the human subject in a kind of post-humanist way. Rather than assume that the human is the center of knowledge creation, he wants to kind of put that to the side and see how an extended notion of human can actually do that instead. So traditional accounts of science take it for granted that the aim of science is to produce representations of how the world really is. In contrast, admitting a role for material agency, this is a direct quote from Pickering, points to the fact that in common with technology, science can also be seen as a realm of instruments, devices, machines, and substances that act, perform, and do things in the material world. And the essay that he writes is an attempt to kind of understand the performative material of devices. So he presents in his paper the term the Mangal. He likes the Mangal because in itself a Mangal suggests unpredictable transformations worked upon whatever gets worked into the machine. So you put something in and something comes out. It's been changed or transformed. Also, you can use mangle as a verb. So, for example, the contours of material agency can be mangled in practice. And meaning can be emergently transformed and delineated in what he calls dialectic of resistance and accommodation. So to give an example of this, in that paper, Pickering talks a lot about Donald Glaser, who eventually won an award for the Nobel Prize in Physics for inventing this bubble chamber. And he went through a series of iterations of designing this bubble chamber. And it's designed to detect cosmic rays. Actually, it was originally designed to do something else, but its original function didn't work. So he had to keep changing and accommodating his design when he was met with the resistances of the object. And Pickering argues that his practice took the form of the dialectic of resistance on accommodation, which shifted in space of all the potential new detector arrangements that he could think of. So it had a material agency in affecting how he worked. He was obviously had a human agency of trying to make it, but it, in its resistances, actually shaped what was produced, which is a bit like David Rugby, so that Nick mentioned earlier. In the system that he was making, he was configuring the system, but the system in itself was configuring how he interacted with it and had an actual agency in how it was made and transformed. So the key point is that the precise material configuration of the non-human agency was temporally emergent in real time in Glaser's practice. Glaser had no way of knowing in advance that most attempts would fail. In fact, nothing indefinitely present when he embarked on these passages of practice determined the future evolution of the material configuration of the chamber. So he had to actually work physically with the material to find out how it would change and how it would bend itself to his will. How long have I got left?
15 minutes.
15 minutes. Loads of time. Excellent. That's okay. 2 minutes? How long have I got left now?
10 minutes.
Yeah, and now? Right. The next person I want to touch briefly on is Karen Berried. which, to be honest, I find harder to understand. And the more I read it, the less I understand it. But I will try and give you my understanding of this, so we can think how it's, really I'm trying to get an understanding of how it's informed my practice, rather than make kind of claims about what it is. She has a lovely article which is called Post-Humanist Performativity, and there's a bit after that, I can't remember what the end of that is, where she outlines an agential realist ontology. And she's working from the writings of Niels Bohr. Let me just find the right bit of my page. Who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his quantum model of the atom. One of perhaps the surprising things of this is Bohr, based on his understanding of quantum mechanics, starts to reject the atomistic metaphysics that takes things as ontological basic entities. So for Bohr, things do not inherit determinate boundaries or properties. So the thing that he's working on here is the wave particle duality of light. 5 minutes. Okay, I got it wrong. So this is the idea which relates to Heidegger's uncertainty principle, where basically you can't know with a lot of information the momentum and the position of an object simultaneously. And in fact, in using the apparatus to measure these things, you can change the outcome of how things exist. So the apparatus measurement is important. They're neither neutral probes nor structures that deterministically depose a particular outcome. So according to Bohr, the primary epistemological unit is not independent objects or things with inherent boundaries and properties, but rather what he terms phenomena, which relates to the inseparability of the observant object agencies of observation. So the observed phenomena are what are the kind of building points of what things are, and they relate to the things and how you observe them as an entity. In fact, these boundaries aren't fixed. They're kind of mutable and changeable. Since I'm running out of time a little bit, I'm going to skip to here. And based on a conversation I had at lunch, and now the magic bit happens. Basically, the outcome of Berried's conclusions is that agency cannot be designated as an attribute of subjects or objects, because they don't exist, they don't pre-exist. They are formed through what she calls interaction in and within the phenomena. So agency is not an attribute which an object has, but it's something which is enacted by the interaction, so by the interactions that are happening between objects in the space. As such, agency is cut loose from its humanist orbit, and any objects can have agent in these scenarios. So now I want to quickly ground some of that in practice. This is the only picture I could find of intra on Google. There's one quote from Pickering which I really took my fancy. One could try to build a new machine, say, which will capture material agency and channel it into a particular direction. The expectation is that that will fail. At minimum, the construction of a new machine entails a kind of open-ended tuning, repeated configuration of what material specifications until some sort of desired or desirable performance emerges. No one can know in advance just what precise tuning will be made in practice, nor what the upshot will be. This is what I mean by temporal emergence. And I didn't read this before I made my system, but it very much sums up the feral cello. The feral cello is a project I've been working on for about 18 months. It was first conceived in a dream just after our technological mediated performance workshop. And here's a picture of the feral cello going to Nîmes, where it took part in a concert, which is this. The idea behind the cello is that it consists of a machine listening section, and some audio processing, and then a reenactment of that DSP through the body of the cello. So not too dissimilar from the feedback cello presented this morning by Alice and Chris, but mine's much less nicely made, and it's basically bits of speakers velcroed onto the body of the instrument. But conceptually, what I'm looking at is a way of the cello itself, the cello in this case being the amalgamation of the machine listening and the acoustic body, altering its acoustic properties live during a performance. So it's listening to itself to a certain extent, and also to the performer. And then based on what it's hearing, it's changing the kind of sound output that it makes. So it's intentionally trying to subvert the performer's intentions, if I can give it an intentionality. And also, it is I was trying to do that in a way that kind of gives the improviser a springboard for creativity, for pushing them beyond what they're doing and basically reconfiguring itself live in performance. So this is the kind of thing I presented to NIME as a description of how it works. Then I reconceptualized that this morning. Thought, well, I've missed out the physical cello, and I missed out the cellist, and I missed out the score that the cellist wrote, because she's also a composer, and I missed out me as a computer operator on stage. So there's lots of agency in here which I've forgotten, which is silly because I'm interested in performance ecologies. And if I go back, I'm quite interested in my own agency in this performance. What am I doing there? Like, I'm doing nothing. Right? I'm sat on stage, basically to monitor the machine, to make sure it doesn't misbehave too much. So I'm kind of I wanted to wear like a flat cap and a workman's suit to show I wasn't really performing in that performance. More, I was just tending the machine, acting as a safety barrier, really, for the cellist who was doing a lot of performing. So I had a different kind of agency in that scenario, depending on how you analyze what's going on. And then I thought, well, if I have this, what else have I missed out? Well, I've missed out the audience. I know Paul and Alice were there, so I put them in, who can exist as a body, or as individuals, or with different interpretations of what's happening. Plus, it was in a venue, the Black Diamond, which had its own agency to the event. It was quite a posh venue, 600-seater auditorium, which is different perhaps to performing in a nightclub that we asked. Kind of gave some legitimacy to the performance. And then it was in the NIME context, so everyone sat in there, we're listening in a NIME way. You know, it wasn't my granny listening to what's going on. So I think what's really important is context. In all of the talks, is how do we give context to the machines and how they're listening and what they're listening, and also how that relates to the agency. All these things have a level of agency in the success of that performance, depending on where you make your embarrassment, your agential cuts. Where are you deciding where the agents stop and start? How do I conceive the cello and that performance system? Is it just a machine learning and a computer attached to a cello? Is the performer attached to that? Is the score attached to that? Is the context of the room attached to that? So I'm left with some questions. This is my last slide. How and where do we draw the boundaries of our systems? How does it affect how we understand them? How do we attribute agency to different parts of the system? How do these agents interact with the Karen Barrett term? How can these agential cuts change throughout performance? And I guess maybe I should add in, how is the context of, how do we physically materialize these algorithms that make sense in a way for what we're trying to do? And that's the end.